They say that secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks, no matter how carefully they are hidden. And when it comes to the British royal family, every secret carries the weight of history, scandal, and heartbreak. Imagine for a moment a quiet country estate, far away from the constant flash of cameras and endless speculation of the press. A place where the gates are locked, the windows are drawn, and the silence is thick enough to make you believe that nothing inside could ever truly shake the world. But behind one particular set of doors, deep in a garage that belonged to Queen Camilla, something was waiting. Something that should not have been there. Something tied to one of the most beloved and tragic figures in modern history, Princess Diana. What they found that day was not just old boxes and forgotten antiques. It was fragments of a life stolen too soon, relics of a woman who changed the world and left it far too early. The story begins with whispers. Whispers that had long circulated among palace insiders and former staffers. Whispers about things Diana once cherished that had never been accounted for after her death. While many of her possessions were catalogued, sealed, and either returned to her sons or preserved in exhibitions, others seemed to vanish. Photographs, letters, personal items that carried her essence, gone without a trace. Some chalked it up to bureaucratic error, others suspected deliberate concealment. For years, no one could say for sure where those missing pieces had gone. And yet, when a dusty garage door creaked open decades later, the truth began to come into focus in the most unsettling way. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The discovery didn't happen under bright spotlights or with journalists swarming the property. It was quieter than that, accidental almost. Routine maintenance, a reshuffling of storage, the kind of ordinary activity that rarely makes headlines. But when workers began to move aside crates and lift heavy tarps, they stumbled onto boxes that felt out of place. Their markings weren't recent, their contents not ordinary. There were hints, faded handwriting, labels that bore Diana's initials, even the faint perfume clinging to fabric sealed for years. It was as if the past had been deliberately tucked away, sealed not only in cardboard and wood, but in secrecy. And the question hung in the air like a storm. Why here, and why in Camilla's possession? To understand the weight of this discovery, you have to go back to the tangled history of Diana and Camilla, a rivalry that was more than just personal. It was cultural, it was historical, it was etched into the very identity of the monarchy. Diana, the people's princess, the young woman who captivated the world with her warmth and vulnerability, versus Camilla, the woman long seen as the shadow in her marriage, the presence Diana herself once admitted had been there from the very beginning. The triangle of Diana, Charles, and Camilla is one of the most scrutinized relationships in royal history. And for Diana's belongings to end up hidden in Camilla's garage, it was not just a discovery of items, but of wounds that never truly healed. The beginning of this story, then, is not simply about finding old objects. It's about confronting the emotional collision of two women bound by love, betrayal, and circumstance. As those boxes were opened, the first glimpses were enough to stir unease. Clothing carefully folded, letters tied with ribbon, jewelry wrapped in cloth as though someone had preserved them deliberately. Each piece wasn't just a material possession, it was a memory, a trace of Diana's life. And each piece raised the same burning question: what drove Camilla to keep these things? Was it guilt, a way of clinging to the woman whose shadow had haunted her for decades? Was it obsession, the kind that makes someone preserve every reminder of their rival? Or was it something more calculated, a way of controlling Diana's legacy by holding on to the fragments that defined her? The middle of the introduction deepens this mystery by drawing us into the significance of what was found. Think about the emotional power of a diary written in Diana's handwriting. Imagine letters where she poured her heart out, perhaps never intended for public eyes. Envision jewelry she once wore during moments that are forever immortalized in photographs. These weren't just forgotten trinkets, they were pieces of history. And yet they had not been in museums, not in the safekeeping of her children, but here, in the storage of the very woman so often painted as Diana's adversary. This juxtaposition alone was enough to send shockwaves. But this is more than a story of discovery. It is also a story of what it reveals about the monarchy, about secrecy, and about the lengths to which individuals will go to control memory. In the royal family, perception is everything. Narratives are carefully curated, images meticulously maintained. To find Diana's belongings hidden away raises questions about whether this was an act of personal obsession or a broader effort to suppress parts of her story. Could it be that within those boxes were truths too uncomfortable to release? Correspondence that contradicted the official narrative, notes that cast figures in unflattering light, tokens that spoke to alliances and betrayals long buried? If so, then this garage was not merely storage. It was a vault of carefully hidden history. And the timing of such a discovery matters. In today's world, with Prince William and Prince Harry walking very different paths, the sudden resurfacing of Diana's lost belongings carries enormous emotional weight. For William, who has shouldered the mantle of the monarchy, and for Harry, who has distanced himself and spoken openly of his mother's pain, the idea that Camilla may have held on to these things is more than just unsettling. It is a reopening of wounds. The rivalry that once consumed their mother's life seems to have reached into the present, shaping the way her memory is handled and perhaps manipulated. The end of this introduction leaves us on the edge of a revelation. These objects, ordinary to the untrained eye, carry extraordinary significance. Each box opened, each ribbon untied, each letter unfolded, is like peeling back a layer of history that had been deliberately kept from view. And the implications ripple outward. What will this mean for Camilla's already fragile public image? What will it mean for the monarchy, which has always walked a careful line between tradition and scandal? And most importantly, what will it mean for Diana's legacy, which the world continues to protect and cherish even decades after her passing? As the dust settled on that garage floor, one truth became clear. This wasn't just about boxes or trinkets or lost property. It was about the unresolved battle between memory and power, love and betrayal, truth and secrecy. And while the answers may lie in what was found, the real story is in why those things were hidden in the first place. That is the journey we are about to take. Step by step, piece by piece, through the belongings of Princess Diana rediscovered in the most unlikely place, the private garage of Queen Camilla. The garage door groaned as it slid open, the sound echoing in the still air like an unwelcome announcement that something hidden for far too long was about to come into the light. Dust swirled in the sunlight that spilled through the gap, and for a moment, it looked ordinary. Tools leaned against the wall, tarps draped over furniture, and stacks of boxes lined the concrete floor. But then the workers noticed something different. The boxes in the far corner didn't match the rest. They were older, sturdier, sealed with a kind of care that suggested the contents weren't just clutter. These boxes had labels, faint and faded, with handwriting that immediately caught attention. One of them bore a set of initials that froze everyone in their tracks. DS, for Diana Spencer. From that moment, the atmosphere shifted. What was supposed to be a mundane clearing of storage turned into the unraveling of one of the most chilling royal mysteries. The realization that items tied to Princess Diana, her belongings, her memories, were found not in her son's homes, not in a royal archive, but here in Camilla's possession, instantly raised the stakes. Why would the woman who was forever cast as Diana's rival keep these things? How had they ended up here? And what did their presence say about the secret world of the monarchy, where public perception and private truth often collide in the most unsettling ways? The opening of the first box revealed fabrics folded with precision. They weren't just clothes. They were iconic pieces, outfits Diana had been photographed in, the kinds that defined eras and left imprints in the collective memory. To see them tucked away here, in a garage where moths and dampness threatened to eat away at history, was jarring. As one piece of fabric was lifted, the faint smell of perfume seemed to linger, as if Diana herself was haunting the discovery. With every item revealed, the air grew heavier, the silence thicker. This wasn't just storage. This was a hidden shrine, one that raised more questions than it answered. The middle of the introduction shifts to the tension between Diana and Camilla, because understanding their relationship is essential to understanding why this discovery matters. Diana was not just another royal figure. She was an icon, adored across the globe for her compassion, her vulnerability, and her defiance in the face of a system that often left her isolated. Camilla, on the other hand, was painted in stark contrast, As the woman in the shadows, the one who represented everything Diana had to fight against in her marriage to Charles. Diana herself once admitted that there were 3 people in her marriage, a phrase that became infamous and immortalized the pain she endured. To find her belongings in Camilla's garage decades later is not just a curiosity. It feels like an invasion, a trespassing into a life that had already been stolen from her once before. At this point, the story is no longer about objects. It is about emotions, rivalries, and the haunting persistence of unresolved history. Imagine the emotional impact of uncovering a personal diary where Diana's thoughts, fears, and hopes were captured in her own handwriting. Imagine seeing letters addressed to close friends, filled with raw honesty about her struggles inside the palace walls. These weren't just things. They were pieces of Diana's soul, and their presence here suggested that someone, for reasons still unclear, wanted to keep them hidden. And then comes the bigger question. What if some of these items carried truths that could alter the way history remembers Diana, Charles, and Camilla? The monarchy is built on narratives, carefully polished stories that preserve its dignity and power. If the contents of these boxes contradicted those narratives, it would explain why they had been sealed away for so long. Were there letters exposing private conflicts, or jewelry that had been promised to her sons but never delivered? Was this about control, about silencing parts of Diana's voice that might still have the power to disrupt even after her death? The more you think about it, the more the discovery feels like an emotional earthquake waiting to explode. For William and Harry, the sons who lost their mother at such a young age, this isn't just about property, it's about betrayal. To know that Camilla, the woman their mother had to fight against during her marriage, was the one in possession of these belongings is a revelation that cuts deep. It risks reopening wounds that time has only barely managed to heal. Harry has often spoken about how the media, the institution, and the endless secrecy around his mother's life shaped him. What would it mean for him to discover that parts of her story had been deliberately kept out of his reach all along? By the time the introduction reaches its end, the audience is standing at the threshold of something much larger than dusty boxes and hidden clothes. They are standing at the crossroads of legacy and secrecy, of obsession and guilt, of memory and control. The garage becomes a symbol, not just a place of storage but a vault of history, locked away because the truth was too dangerous to expose. And as the final box waits to be opened, the tension becomes unbearable. What if the next object revealed isn't just a relic but a revelation that shakes the foundation of the monarchy itself? This is the journey you are about to witness. From the discovery of Diana's belongings to the unraveling of a story that spans decades of love, betrayal, and the fight for legacy. The past has a way of demanding to be seen, no matter how deeply it is buried. And here, in the quiet shadows of Camilla's garage, the past finally broke free. The garage itself was ordinary, the kind of space that people rarely think twice about. A few garden tools leaned against the wall, boxes stacked high with seasonal decorations, bicycles with rusting chains. Yet in the farthest corner, beneath layers of dust and neglect, stood a cluster of wooden chests and sealed crates that didn't belong to the rhythm of everyday life. They had weight to them, not just physical but historical. When the first lock was cracked open and the lid slowly lifted, silence fell over the small group of workers who had been tasked with the job. They were staring at the kind of discovery that changes stories, the kind that twists history into something far more unsettling. Inside, folded with precision, were garments that didn't belong to Camilla. These weren't the tweeds and practical coats she was known to wear. No, these were delicate, elegant, unmistakably from another era. A carefully preserved gown, the kind Diana had once worn at charity galas, was the first clue. A photograph tucked between layers of fabric showed her smiling, radiant, in the same outfit. To see it there, hidden away in this garage, was like opening a window into the past. Immediately the question surfaced. How could this have ended up here? The room grew heavier as more boxes were opened. There were clippings of newspapers that followed Diana's most public appearances, photographs carefully cut out and placed into envelopes, and even handwritten notes slipped into the folds of clothing. Each item was ordinary on its own, but together they told a story of deliberate collection. This wasn't random storage, it was curation. Someone had chosen to place these things here, away from the eyes of William, Harry, and the public. Someone had taken the time to preserve not just objects, but fragments of Diana's very existence. The discovery of these belongings immediately opened the door to speculation. Why were they here? Had they been taken after Diana's death, spirited away from the official inventory that was meant to ensure her possessions went to her sons? Were these pieces handed down privately and quietly by someone who wanted to keep them from public view? Or was this a personal act on Camilla's part, holding on to them in secret as a way to keep control over the memory of the woman who overshadowed her for decades? The very setting of the discovery, a garage, not a palace vault or museum, suggested secrecy rather than protection. As the workers unearthed the boxes, they noted the handwriting on the labels. Some carried Diana's initials, while others bore descriptions like personal letters or to be sorted. The handwriting wasn't Camilla's. It seemed older, familiar to those who had seen Diana's notes preserved in archives. The reality of it began to sink in. These were not simply replicas or duplicates. These were genuine belongings, untouched since the 1990s, somehow hidden away where no one would think to look. The first box alone was enough to spark disbelief, but the second one left no room for doubt. Inside were photo albums, each filled with candid shots that had never been seen publicly. Diana laughing with her sons in the garden, Diana hugging children at hospitals, Diana walking barefoot along a beach. These weren't the glossy images captured by paparazzi. They were private, intimate, and filled with a sense of warmth that only family members should have preserved. To see them stacked here, gathering dust, felt like trespassing into something sacred. And then came the letters, bundled together with ribbons, some neatly folded, others worn at the edges. The letters were the heartbeat of the discovery. They were Diana's voice, frozen in ink, speaking across decades. Some were addressed to close friends, others to staff, and a few even to Charles during the tumult of their marriage. The content of these letters has never been publicly revealed, but their mere presence raises chilling possibilities. Were they letters that revealed more about her suffering, her suspicions, her fears? Were they letters that contradicted the official narrative surrounding her life and death? And most importantly, were they hidden here because someone knew that their contents could still shake the monarchy to its core? The sheer emotional weight of the moment was unbearable. Every box opened peeled back another layer of history that had been carefully buried. Each piece, from gowns to photographs to letters, was a reminder of a life cut short and a voice silenced too soon. Yet here she was, Diana, speaking again through the belongings that carried her presence. For those who discovered the boxes, it was not just about handling old possessions. It was about confronting the ghost of a woman whose memory continues to haunt the institution she once tried to serve. The reaction of those who first saw the items was a mix of awe and unease. Awe, because they were holding pieces of history tied to a global icon. Unease, because they were also holding evidence of secrecy and obsession. Nothing about this was accidental. The careful folding, the deliberate preservation, the locked crates, all pointed to intentional concealment. Someone wanted these things hidden, and that someone either was Camilla or someone acting in her interest. The very idea of Camilla safeguarding these items is enough to send shivers down the spine. For decades, she was cast as Diana's rival, the woman who symbolized the breakdown of her marriage. Diana herself admitted to feeling haunted by Camilla's presence in her life. To discover her personal belongings in Camilla's garage decades later is not only unsettling, it's almost poetic in its cruelty. Was this Camilla's way of holding onto the memory of the woman who once overshadowed her? Was it guilt, a strange attempt at atonement? Or was it something darker, a way of controlling Diana's narrative even after death? It's important to remember that the monarchy thrives on perception. The way history remembers its figures is just as important as the events themselves. If these belongings contained truths that challenged the official story, it would explain why they were hidden away. And it would also explain why their discovery feels so explosive. Imagine the damage if a letter revealed Diana's private fears about her safety, or if photographs showed evidence of moments the palace never wanted released. Imagine the chaos if these belongings proved that Diana had tried to leave a trail of truth for her sons, only for it to be buried instead. The first chapter of this story, the garage discovery itself, is like opening a Pandora's box. Once the lid was lifted, there was no going back. The belongings of Diana weren't just relics. They were secrets, emotions, and revelations waiting to be unleashed. Each box told a story, each item a clue, and together they formed a puzzle that pointed toward obsession, guilt, and the unhealed wounds of one of the most infamous rivalries in royal history. And yet, as haunting as this discovery was, it was only the beginning. For the deeper the search went, the more disturbing the revelations became. What else was waiting in those boxes? And why, after all these years, had they remained untouched in the shadowy corner of Camilla's garage? The answers would only come with time, but the world would never look at this story the same way again. The second box sat heavier than the first, its edges worn, but its locks still intact. It was as if time itself had pressed down on it, holding secrets in place, resisting every attempt to let them breathe. When the latch was finally forced open, the air inside the garage seemed to shift. The sound of the creak echoed longer than it should have, filling the space with an eerie silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. All eyes were fixed on the dark opening, on the moment where memory and secrecy collided. Inside was not clutter. It wasn't the kind of random accumulation you might expect from a household garage. It was deliberate. Layer upon layer of wrapping paper, old cloth, and string concealed the contents as if the items had been buried in ceremony. The first bundle revealed more than just objects. It revealed intention. There, tied with ribbon, were envelopes marked in a familiar, slanting script. The words were faint, faded by age, but unmistakably Diana's handwriting. To hold such letters in your hand is to feel history pulsing through your fingertips. They were personal, intimate, words written by Diana during moments when the cameras weren't flashing, when the world wasn't listening. Her letters were her safe place, her outlet, the one space where she could release the truth without fear of judgment. Some were addressed to close friends, others to family members, a few to palace staff. Every sentence was a window into the private world of the woman the public only knew through headlines. These weren't just notes. They were confessions, observations, pieces of her heart sealed away. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the question of how they had gotten here. These weren't artifacts meant for public display. They were deeply personal documents, the kind that should have gone directly to William and Harry, or at least to the Royal Archive. Instead, they had ended up hidden in a garage, stored away like contraband. Had they been taken intentionally, removed from Diana's estate after her death? Was this the work of someone within the palace, funneling sensitive belongings into the hands of Camilla to keep them away from the public? The very existence of these letters in this place was enough to cast suspicion, not only on Camilla but on the entire machinery of secrecy that surrounds the monarchy. The envelopes were not the only treasures. Wrapped in silk were pieces of jewelry, not the grand tiaras or crowns associated with the royal family, but more intimate items. A bracelet, a pair of earrings, a locket. They were the kinds of pieces Diana was often photographed wearing in casual moments, gifts from friends, tokens from her children, reminders of the life she lived outside the confines of royal duty. To see them here, in this garage, was unsettling. They were not heirlooms meant to be hidden. They were keepsakes meant to be cherished, to be passed down through generations. And yet here they were, tucked away in darkness. This raised another uncomfortable question. Was this an act of protection or possession? Was Camilla, in some twisted way, safeguarding these items because she understood their value, because she knew what they meant to Diana and her family? Or was this possession, a way of holding power over the memory of the woman who had haunted her for decades? The line between protection and obsession is thin, and in this case, it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. As the second box was emptied, a picture began to emerge. This was not random storage. It was calculated. Every item had been preserved with care, as if someone had wanted them to remain intact for future discovery. The neat folding of garments, the tied bundles of letters, the careful wrapping of jewelry, all suggested that whoever placed these items here understood their significance. This wasn't about forgetting. It was about keeping them hidden in plain sight. What makes this discovery even more haunting is the symbolic weight of it. A garage is not a palace vault, not a museum, not a sacred archive. It is a space of neglect, a place where things are left to decay. To find Diana's belongings here is to see her memory treated as something disposable, something unworthy of reverence. And yet, paradoxically, the care with which the items were stored shows the opposite, that they were treasured, preserved, protected from the elements. The contradiction is chilling. The forbidden boxes, as they began to be called by those who knew of their existence, represent more than just a collection of items. They represent a secret battle for memory. They force us to ask, who owns Diana's legacy? Her sons, who carry her blood? The monarchy, which shaped her life and her tragedy? Or those like Camilla, who lived in her shadow and perhaps felt compelled to keep hold of pieces of her? The answer isn't clear, and that is what makes this discovery so powerful, so disturbing. There were whispers among insiders that this wasn't the only set of boxes, that others existed, scattered, hidden away in places only a few people knew about. If that were true, then the garage was just one chapter in a larger story, one that points to deliberate concealment on a scale no one had fully understood before. It suggested a pattern, a habit of locking away the uncomfortable truths of Diana's life so they could not interfere with the carefully curated narrative of the monarchy. But why would Camilla, of all people, want to keep these things? The public will forever see her as Diana's rival, the woman whose presence in Charles's life broke Diana's spirit. Perhaps that is precisely why. Perhaps Camilla knew that without these belongings, without these reminders, Diana's memory would slowly fade, and her own place in history would become easier to secure. Or perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps holding on to these items was her way of keeping Diana close, of carrying the weight of the woman whose shadow she could never escape. Guilt and obsession often look the same from the outside. The end of this chapter leaves us with unease. The forbidden boxes, filled with Diana's personal belongings, were more than just storage. They were a vault of secrets, a symbol of obsession, a question mark carved into history. Each item inside carried a story, and each story carried consequences. Who placed them here? Why were they kept secret for so long? And what would happen if the world knew the full truth of what they contained? This is not just about the boxes themselves, but about what they represent. A monarchy built on control, a rivalry that never ended, and a memory too powerful to ever truly be silenced. The forbidden boxes of Queen Camilla's garage are not just history. They are a mirror held up to the present, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truths about power, legacy, and the lengths people will go to hold on to both. The rivalry between Diana and Camilla is not just a footnote in royal history. It is one of its defining battles, a clash that shaped the way the monarchy was seen by the world. To understand why the discovery of Diana's belongings in Camilla's garage sent such shockwaves, we need to return to the beginning, to the tangled triangle that defined decades of royal life. It is impossible to separate the objects from the emotions, the boxes from the heartbreak, without first revisiting the story of two women bound together by love, betrayal, and circumstance. Diana was just 19 when she was introduced to the role of a lifetime. Young, shy, and completely unprepared for the relentless scrutiny that came with marrying the future king, she was thrust into a world that expected perfection. At first, the fairy tale dazzled the public. This beautiful young woman walking down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral, radiant in her gown, stepping into history. But even on that day, shadows loomed. Camilla was in the congregation. Diana later admitted she had searched for her, nervous, uneasy, as if sensing that her presence meant more than friendship with Charles. And she was right. Camilla and Charles had been close long before Diana entered the picture. Their relationship, though interrupted by marriages and duty, had never truly ended. Camilla was the one Charles confided in, the one he leaned on, the one he loved with a depth that Diana quickly realized she could never replace. Imagine being a young bride, barely out of her teens, walking into one of the most famous families in the world, only to discover that your husband's heart belonged to someone else. That was the reality Diana lived with every single day. It wasn't long before Diana began to speak openly of the strain. She admitted to friends, and later in interviews, that there were always 3 people in her marriage, a phrase that became one of the most devastating confessions in royal history. That simple sentence captured the heartbreak of her situation, the impossibility of her role. While the public adored her for her kindness, her vulnerability, and her ability to connect with ordinary people. Behind palace doors, she was fighting a losing battle against a love that had been established long before she arrived. Camilla, for her part, was not a glamorous figure in the way Diana was. She did not have the same global charisma, the same ability to light up a room. But she had something else. She had Charles's loyalty. For him, she was an anchor, a confidant who understood him in a way Diana never could. This was not simply a love triangle. It was a collision of worlds. Diana, representing innocence, compassion, and a new kind of monarchy that embraced the people. Camilla, representing tradition, familiarity, and the old ways of royal life. And Charles, torn but ultimately unwilling to let go of Camilla, left Diana isolated in a gilded cage. The rivalry between Diana and Camilla was not played out in screaming matches or public confrontations. It was quieter, more insidious. It was in the way Diana felt watched, judged, and undermined. It was in the phone calls she intercepted, the whispered conversations that confirmed her worst fears. It was in the way Camilla remained a constant presence, not just in Charles's heart, but in his daily life. Diana herself once confronted Camilla directly, in a moment of rare defiance. At a party, she cornered her and said, "I know what's going on between you and Charles, and I want you to know that." Camilla's response, calm and unapologetic, was that Diana already had everything the world could want: a crown, children, a position of influence. So why couldn't she simply be content? That exchange summed up the cold reality of their relationship. Camilla never denied her role, and Diana was left to suffer the consequences of loving a man who loved someone else. The public, of course, took Diana's side. She was the one they saw crying in interviews, the one who hugged AIDS patients without gloves, the one who walked through minefields, the one who admitted her flaws and wore her heart on her sleeve. She became the people's princess, not because of her title, but because of her humanity. Camilla, in contrast, became a villain in the eyes of many. For years, she was painted as the other woman, the one who broke the fairy tale. Even after Diana's death, that image lingered, and to some, it has never faded. So when Diana's belongings surfaced in Camilla's garage, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about storage. It was about history, about wounds that had never healed. It was about the memory of Diana being literally held in the possession of the woman who had caused her so much pain. To the world, it looked like proof that the rivalry had not ended with Diana's death. It had continued, silently, through the preservation of her things. It was as if Camilla had been keeping not just objects but fragments of Diana herself, hidden away where no one could see them. The emotional weight of this is staggering. Imagine being William or Harry, already burdened with the grief of losing their mother, only to discover that her most intimate belongings had been stored by the woman they once blamed for her unhappiness. The betrayal would be unbearable. It reopens every wound, every memory of watching their mother suffer in silence. It forces them to relive the years when Diana's pain was dismissed, when her cries for help went unheard. Now, decades later, the belongings that should have been theirs are discovered in the possession of the very person their mother once dreaded. The rivalry carved into history between Diana and Camilla was never about beauty or status. It was about survival. Diana was fighting to be loved, to be seen, to be heard in a system that valued silence and obedience. Camilla was fighting to hold on to the man she loved, regardless of the cost. Both women were trapped in roles they did not fully choose, yet both left indelible marks on the monarchy. One became an icon, a global symbol of compassion. The other became queen, finally legitimized after years of scandal. And in the middle of it all lies the discovery of boxes in a garage, a reminder that the past refuses to stay buried. This chapter of the story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. The monarchy is built on carefully managed images, but beneath those images are real people with real wounds. Diana and Camilla were not just figures in a soap opera. They were women whose lives collided in ways that neither could escape. Their rivalry shaped the monarchy, shaped Charles, shaped William and Harry, and continues to shape the way the public sees the royal family today. The discovery of Diana's belongings in Camilla's garage is not just shocking because of what was found. It is shocking because of what it represents. It represents a rivalry that outlived Diana herself. It represents the ongoing battle over her legacy, a battle that continues to this day. And it represents the uncomfortable truth that even in death, Diana's presence is still felt, still contested, still powerful enough to unsettle the highest throne in the land. Chapter 3 closes with a haunting realization. The rivalry between Diana and Camilla was never just personal. It was historical, cultural, and deeply symbolic. The belongings found in that garage are not just objects. They are scars, reminders of a conflict that reshaped the monarchy forever. And as the story unfolds, the question remains, were these items hidden out of guilt, out of obsession, or out of a desperate attempt to control the memory of the woman who still overshadows the crown? The fourth box was different from the rest. Its lid had been sealed with thick tape, reinforced at the edges, as if someone wanted to make absolutely certain that whatever was inside would never spill out accidentally. The workers who had been uncovering the garage felt the weight of it before they even opened it. When the tape was cut and the lid slowly pried away, the garage seemed to hold its breath. Inside lay items that felt far more intimate than photographs or newspaper clippings. These were the personal belongings of Princess Diana. Her clothes, her accessories, the everyday fragments of her life that spoke louder than any official biography could. The first thing lifted from the box was a silk blouse, pale blue, with embroidery at the cuffs. It had been carefully folded, preserved with tissue paper between the layers. A faint trace of perfume lingered in the fibers, the kind of scent that clings to fabric long after the wearer has gone. The blouse was familiar to anyone who had seen pictures of Diana in her early years as a royal. She had worn it during visits to children's hospitals, where her warmth and her willingness to kneel on the floor beside patients endeared her to the public. Holding that blouse was like holding a moment in time, a reminder of the compassion that had made her the people's princess. Beneath the blouse were more garments, each telling its own story. A red jacket, vibrant and tailored, worn during public engagements where Diana's presence lit up the crowd. A pair of casual trousers, creased in a way that suggested they had once been lived in, not displayed. Even a sweater with signs of wear, perhaps from days when she was not in front of cameras, but simply Diana at home, a mother with her children. These were not museum pieces polished for public admiration. They were real, lived-in clothing that carried the imprint of her body, the touch of her hands, the warmth of her skin. And then came something even more personal, a collection of handbags and shoes, carefully wrapped in cloth. Among them was a clutch bag Diana had been photographed carrying during a visit abroad. Inside the clutch was a folded piece of paper, a note scribbled in Diana's handwriting. The words were brief, almost rushed, but they carried weight. It was a reminder to herself, a list of things to do, with "Call William" written at the bottom. Simple, ordinary, but profoundly human. To see such an everyday note was to be reminded that behind the glamour and the headlines was a mother who lived with the same small responsibilities and anxieties as anyone else. The emotional intensity of this discovery cannot be overstated. These were not jewels locked away in vaults, not priceless heirlooms meant for future queens. These were Diana's personal items, the pieces of her life that showed her as a woman, not just as a princess. To find them here, hidden in Camilla's garage, was almost unbearable. It suggested a kind of intrusion into Diana's life that felt deeply unsettling. Why would these things, so intimately tied to her, end up in the possession of the woman who had caused her so much pain? The significance of personal belongings lies not in their material value, but in their emotional resonance. Clothing carries memory. A sweater can remind you of a loved one long after they are gone. A handbag can hold secrets in its lining. A note can capture the voice of someone you can no longer hear. For William and Harry, seeing these items would be like being confronted with their mother's presence all over again. It would be comforting in one sense, but devastating in another, because of where and how they had been found. There were also objects that seemed almost too fragile to handle. Children's drawings tucked into the folds of a diary, photographs of Diana with her boys at play, little keepsakes that spoke of her role as a mother. One photo, bent at the edges, showed Diana laughing on a picnic blanket, her arms around William and Harry as they squirmed with the energy of childhood. To see that photo hidden away in a garage instead of framed on a mantelpiece or stored in an archive was heartbreaking. It felt wrong. as if someone had stolen not just her belongings, but pieces of her love for her children. The more items that emerged from the box, the clearer it became that this was no accident. These were not misplaced possessions. They had been taken, deliberately, from somewhere they should have remained safe, and placed here instead. And with each discovery, the sense of violation grew. For the public, Diana's belongings are sacred, symbols of a woman who broke through the walls of royalty to connect with ordinary people. For her sons, they are personal treasures, reminders of the mother they lost. To see them hidden in Camilla's garage, in darkness and dust, was to reopen wounds that had never truly healed. The narrative of Diana's life has always been one of contrast. Public adoration against private suffering, glamour against loneliness, resilience against despair. These belongings embodied that contrast. They were beautiful, but fragile, ordinary, but profound. They spoke not of the princess the world adored, but of the woman who lived and struggled behind closed doors. And that is why their discovery was so powerful. They reminded the world that Diana was not just an icon, not just a tragedy, but a human being whose life was taken too soon. This chapter of the story leaves us with haunting questions. Why did Camilla have these things? Did she keep them as a way of holding power over Diana's memory, or as a way of confronting her own guilt? Did she see them as trophies, or as burdens she could never bring herself to let go of? The answers may never be clear, but the discovery of Diana's personal belongings in Camilla's garage forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. The past is never truly buried. It lingers, it haunts, and sometimes it resurfaces in the most shocking of ways. The personal belongings unearthed in that garage were not just objects. They were echoes of Diana's life, preserved in silence, hidden in secrecy, waiting to be found. And when they were, they reminded the world that Diana's story is not over. It continues to shape the present, to challenge the monarchy, and to demand answers from those who would rather keep the past locked away. When the fifth box was dragged out from beneath the dusty tarps and pushed into the open space of the garage, the atmosphere changed again. It was smaller than the others, but its size only made it more intriguing. A small chest, bound with brass hinges and an old lock, sat heavy on the concrete floor. There was something ominous about it, as if it had been set apart intentionally. Unlike the previous crates filled with clothes, jewelry, and photographs, this one had the feel of secrecy. When the lock was forced open and the lid creaked back, the silence that followed was heavier than words. Inside lay bundles of paper, each tied with ribbon, each yellowed with age. The scent of old ink and parchment filled the air. These weren't just letters. These were Diana's letters, the voice of a woman silenced long ago, preserved in ink. The first bundle was carefully unwrapped, and the handwriting immediately caught attention. It was unmistakably Diana's, the fluid, slanting script that had once filled birthday cards, notes to friends, and personal diaries. The words on the first page trembled with emotion. She spoke of loneliness, of the pain of living in a marriage where love had been replaced by distance. She wrote about her fears, about the eyes always watching her, about the suffocating weight of duty. These were not the polished words of a public figure, but the raw outpourings of a human heart. To read them was to hear Diana herself whispering across time, telling the truth she had once been too afraid to say aloud. Letter after letter revealed the same theme: isolation. She spoke of nights spent awake, of crying behind closed doors, of feeling invisible in a palace full of people. She spoke of Charles's coldness, of Camilla's constant presence, of the way her every move was scrutinized and judged. And yet, in the same pages, there was love. She wrote about William and Harry with tenderness, calling them her anchors, her reason for enduring. She described their laughter, their small gestures, their innocence as her greatest joy. These letters were not just confessions. They were a map of Diana's inner world, filled with both sorrow and hope. Some of the letters were addressed to friends, women she trusted with her pain. She confided in them about the battles she faced, about her doubts and her dreams of breaking free. In one letter, she hinted at her fear that she was being deliberately silenced, that her struggles were being erased by those who wanted to preserve the image of a perfect royal family. Reading her words now, hidden away in Camilla's garage, The irony was almost unbearable. Diana had feared being silenced, and yet here her voice was buried, locked away, hidden from the world. The most shocking discovery, however, was a series of letters addressed directly to Charles. They were never meant for public eyes. In them, Diana pleaded for understanding, for love, for acknowledgement of her pain. She wrote about knowing of his relationship with Camilla, about the humiliation she felt, about her desperate attempts to save their marriage. Some lines dripped with sadness, others with anger, but all of them carried the raw intensity of a woman who had been betrayed. To read these letters now, in the shadow of Camilla's garage, was almost surreal. They were living proof of a rivalry that had torn Diana apart, and now they lay in the hands of the very woman who had been at the center of it. The question of how these letters had ended up here is one that still haunts the story. Were they taken after Diana's death, carefully removed from her possessions before her sons could see them? Were they kept intentionally to prevent their contents from becoming public? Or did someone close to her deliver them directly into Camilla's possession as part of a darker game of control? No matter the explanation, the outcome was the same. Diana's most personal words had been hidden in secrecy, far away from the people who should have cherished them. The emotional weight of these letters is impossible to overstate. They are not just documents. They are Diana's voice. They are the sound of her pain, her resilience, her love, and her fear. For William and Harry, reading them would be like hearing their mother speak from beyond the grave. But to know that these words had been kept from them, hidden instead in Camilla's private space, would cut like a blade. It is one thing to grieve the loss of a mother. It is another to discover that her most personal thoughts had been concealed by the very woman who once caused her so much anguish. And yet, even in the darkest letters, there were glimpses of Diana's hope. She wrote about her dream of a future where she could be free, where she could raise her sons outside the suffocating shadow of the monarchy. She wrote about wanting to use her platform to bring light to others, to fight for causes no one else dared to champion. Those hopes never fully came to pass, but they reveal the heart of the woman she was. Her letters are a reminder that Diana was not just a victim of circumstance. She was a fighter, determined to leave a legacy of compassion. What makes this discovery even more unsettling is the symbolic weight of Camilla having them. To hold on to these letters is not just to hold on to paper. It is to hold on to Diana's truth. It is to control the voice of the woman who once overshadowed her. Whether it was guilt or obsession, the fact remains that Camilla's possession of these letters feels like an intrusion into the most sacred part of Diana's life. It suggests a battle not just for Charles's heart, but for the narrative of history itself. The letters raise questions that go beyond personal rivalry. They speak to the way the monarchy handles truth. How much of Diana's suffering was hidden deliberately? How much of her story was erased in order to protect the image of the crown? If these letters had surfaced earlier, would history have remembered her differently? Would the world have seen even more clearly the injustice she endured? The answers to these questions may never be fully known, but the letters themselves are proof that Diana's story was far more complex, far more painful than the palace ever wanted to admit. By the end of this chapter, the weight of the discovery is clear. The love letters, the pleas, the confessions, each page is a piece of Diana's soul, hidden away for decades. Their presence in Camilla's garage is more than shocking. It is almost cruel. It forces us to confront the reality of a rivalry that never truly ended, a rivalry that continues to shape the legacy of the monarchy even today. Diana's letters were not meant to be hidden. They were meant to be read, to be remembered, to be cherished by those who loved her. And now, uncovered at last, they demand to be heard. When the sixth crate was brought forward, there was already a palpable sense of dread and anticipation among those who had been uncovering the garage. Each box so far had told its own story. Clothes that captured moments of compassion, letters that exposed heartbreak, photographs that immortalized Diana as a mother and a princess. But this crate, heavier and wrapped in thick canvas, seemed to hum with a different kind of energy. When the bindings were cut and the lid finally pried loose, the discovery inside silenced everyone. What lay within was not paper or fabric, but gleaming pieces of metal and stone, royal jewelry and keepsakes that once belonged to Diana. At first glance, they were breathtaking. Necklaces that sparkled even under the dim garage lights, bracelets nestled in velvet pouches, rings still shining as though they had been worn yesterday. Each piece was unmistakable, captured countless times in photographs of Diana during her most iconic moments. There was the sapphire choker she had worn during her visit to Australia, the delicate pearl earrings she had often paired with her tiaras, and a simple gold bracelet that carried far more sentimental value than financial worth. These were not just ornaments, they were symbols. Every jewel carried a story, and every story carried Diana's memory. The shock of the discovery was not in the jewels themselves. After all, everyone knew Diana had owned such treasures, but in their location. These were not pieces held in secure vaults under palace guard. They were not displayed in museums or handed down to her sons, as many had assumed. They were here, in Camilla's garage, wrapped in cloth and hidden away as if they were secrets rather than heirlooms. The contrast was staggering. Jewelry that once dazzled on red carpets and state dinners, that once glimmered under the gaze of millions, was now covered in dust, lying forgotten in a storage box. The question that hung in the air was inescapable. Why? Why were these pieces tied so closely to Diana's identity, not in the hands of William and Harry? Why had they been denied the right to hold onto their mother's treasures, to see them passed down as part of her legacy? Instead, the jewelry had been hidden in the possession of the very woman Diana once saw as her rival. The symbolism was almost unbearable. It suggested that Camilla had not only replaced Diana in life, but had sought to possess her even in death, by keeping the most personal symbols of her memory close at hand. As the pieces were examined more closely, small details emerged that made the discovery even more haunting. Some of the jewelry bore inscriptions, short engravings that carried private meaning. One locket, delicate and worn, opened to reveal tiny photographs of William and Harry as young boys. It was the kind of piece Diana had treasured privately, carrying her sons close to her heart even when they were apart. To see it here, tucked away in Camilla's storage, was like an intrusion into Diana's motherhood itself. Another discovery was a simple ring, not grand or expensive, but etched with words in Diana's handwriting, a gift she had given to a close friend. The fact that such a personal item had ended up here raised even more disturbing possibilities. How many of Diana's belongings had been siphoned away, removed from her estate, and hidden from the people who loved her most? The jewelry, more than the letters or photographs, carried a kind of intimate weight. These were items she had worn on her body, items that had touched her skin, items that the world had seen sparkling on her in moments of joy and sorrow alike. The symbolic power of jewelry cannot be overstated. In the world of royalty, jewels are not just adornments. They are markers of history, of status, of legacy. They pass from queen to queen, from mother to daughter, from generation to generation. To find Diana's pieces here, in the garage of the woman who once threatened her happiness, was to see that legacy interrupted. It was as if Diana's story had been hijacked, her treasures taken from the path they were meant to follow and diverted into secrecy. For the public, the idea of these jewels being hidden away is a betrayal. Many of them had been gifts from nations during official tours, given in honor of Diana's role as Princess of Wales. They were not private trinkets to be locked away, but symbols of diplomacy and gratitude, meant to remain part of the royal collection. Their disappearance into Camilla's garage raised questions not just of morality, but of legality. Did Camilla have any right to possess them? Or had they been deliberately concealed to prevent them from being displayed, to stop them from reminding the world of Diana's enduring power? For William and Harry, the emotional toll of such a discovery would be incalculable. These jewels should have been part of their inheritance, physical reminders of the mother they lost. To see them here, treated like contraband, would reopen every wound of betrayal they had endured. Harry, who has spoken openly about how the monarchy's handling of his mother's memory shaped his decision to leave, would see in these jewels a confirmation of his deepest fears, that Diana's legacy was being controlled, distorted, and hidden. William, who carries the burden of preserving the monarchy, would be forced to confront the painful reality that the institution he is destined to lead has never fully honored his mother. The jewelry also raised another haunting question. Was this collection complete, or just a fraction? Were there more pieces hidden elsewhere, in other secret places, taken from Diana's possession and locked away? If so, then the garage was not just a storage space. It was a doorway into a much larger web of concealment, one that stretched deep into the walls of the monarchy itself. And yet, even in this shocking discovery, there was a strange kind of beauty. To see these jewels again, to imagine Diana wearing them, to remember the moments when they sparkled on her as she smiled at the crowds, was to be reminded of her enduring presence. They were not just relics of the past. They were symbols of a woman who continues to live in the hearts of millions. But their presence in Camilla's garage tainted that beauty, turning it into something unsettling. It was as if Diana's light had been captured and hidden away, smothered in secrecy. By the end of this chapter, the truth is undeniable. The royal jewelry and keepsakes found in Camilla's garage are more than material possessions. They are symbols of power, of love, of betrayal. They tell a story not just of Diana's life, but of what happened to her memory after she was gone. They force us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the battle over Diana's legacy is far from over. It continues to this day, fought not in public but in the shadows, in the hidden corners of places like Camilla's garage. The seventh discovery was not made in silence. By the time the previous boxes had been opened, there was already an air of unease, so thick it clung to every corner of the garage. But when the next container was pulled forward, something about it felt different. Smaller, less ornate, and yet heavier in the way secrets can be. It seemed to carry with it the weight of something more psychological than physical. The lid opened not to jewels or clothing, not to photographs or handwritten letters, but to items that together painted a portrait of fixation. This was not Diana's voice speaking directly anymore. This was Camilla's. And what it revealed was a mirror reflecting something deeper, obsession. Inside the container were clippings. Newspapers, magazines, tabloids. Years of them, stacked in neat piles. Every headline, every photograph, every article about Diana seemed to have been collected and kept. Some were positive, celebrating Diana as the people's princess, glowing in her humanitarian work, her beauty, her compassion. Others were darker, focusing on her struggles, her confessions, the breakdown of her marriage. But together they formed a timeline, almost like a dossier, chronicling Diana's life from the moment she entered the royal scene to the day of her tragic death. The collection was far too methodical to be casual. These weren't random cuttings shoved into drawers. They were categorized, some stored in binders, others preserved in plastic sleeves, as though someone wanted them to remain pristine. There were notes scribbled in the margins in a hand that was not Diana's, remarks underlined in ink, certain phrases circled again and again. It was as if someone had studied these articles, analyzed them, dissected the public image of Diana in painstaking detail. Next to the clippings lay photographs that had never been released to the press. Some were duplicates of official portraits, others appeared candid, perhaps taken by staff or insiders. Diana at garden parties, Diana stepping into cars, Diana smiling in ways that seemed more forced than genuine. These weren't keepsakes, they were surveillance. It raised the unnerving question of how these images had been obtained and why they had been kept. The deeper the box was searched, the more troubling the discoveries became. There were audio cassettes, their labels marked only with dates. Nobody knew what they contained without playing them, but their presence alone suggested recordings, perhaps of conversations, perhaps of broadcasts preserved for private listening. There were even small notebooks, not filled with Diana's writing, but with observations. Lists of where she had been, who she had been with, what she had worn. The detail was exhaustive, almost clinical, as if someone had been keeping score. And then, tucked between these notes, was something that made the air grow heavier. Copies of letters Diana had written, letters that had already been discovered in earlier boxes. But here they were, duplicated, cataloged, cross-referenced with newspaper stories of the same time. It was clear this was more than collecting. This was studying, archiving, creating a parallel record of Diana's life as if to understand her, or perhaps to control her memory. The mirror of obsession is not always obvious. On the surface, keeping mementos of someone might seem like admiration or guilt. But when the collection becomes systematic, when it begins to look like surveillance rather than memory, it takes on a darker tone. What these boxes revealed was a side of Camilla that the public had only speculated about. For decades, she had lived under the shadow of Diana's global popularity. No matter how hard she tried, Diana remained the symbol the world adored, the face on the front page, the princess immortalized in public love. Camilla, in contrast, was often vilified, cast as the villain in Diana's story. The clippings and notes suggested a woman who had spent years staring into that shadow, unable to escape it, perhaps even compelled to possess it in the only way she could, by collecting it. Psychologists often talk about the way obsession can masquerade as control. By cataloging Diana's life, by holding on to every article, every photo, every word, Camilla may have been trying to assert dominance over a legacy she could never escape. It was as if by having these things in her possession, she could rewrite the narrative, or at least prevent it from slipping entirely beyond her reach. Yet the irony is that in doing so, she only proved how deeply Diana continued to live in her mind. This discovery also forces us to consider the role of guilt. Could it be that Camilla kept these items as a way of confronting her own part in Diana's suffering? Holding on to the evidence of Diana's life, both the triumphs and the tragedies, may have been her way of carrying the burden. Guilt and obsession often blur together, one feeding the other. Perhaps she could not let go of Diana, not because she wanted to honor her, but because she could not escape the role she had played in her pain. The symbolism of this box is profound. It was not just filled with objects, it was filled with perspective. It revealed how one woman may have viewed another, not just as a rival, but as a figure she could not ignore, even in death. To keep these things was to admit that Diana's presence had never faded, that she was still the unseen figure haunting Camilla's reign, still the mirror in which she saw herself measured and judged. For William and Harry, this discovery would be even more painful than the jewelry or the clothing. Those items belonged to their mother. They were pieces of her life. But this box was something different. It was not Diana's, it was Camilla's. It revealed how their mother had been watched, studied, perhaps even obsessed over. To realize that Camilla had preserved this archive of their mother's existence would be like discovering that her memory had been dissected, her life reduced to files and notes in someone else's possession. It would feel like a violation, a continuation of the scrutiny that had haunted her in life, now carried on in death. The mirror of obsession forces us to ask questions that have no easy answers. Was this collection an attempt at understanding, or a desperate act of control? Was it driven by guilt, envy, or fear? And what does it say about the monarchy itself, that such a private archive could exist in secret, hidden in a garage, never meant for public eyes? By the end of this chapter, the picture is clearer but more disturbing. The belongings of Diana were not just stored, they were studied. Her life had been mapped, her memory catalogued, her presence preserved not with reverence, but with a kind of fixation that reveals more about Camilla than about Diana. It was not just about holding on to history. It was about trying to possess it, to claim authority over a legacy too powerful to erase. The obsession reflected in those boxes is a mirror none of us would want to face. For Camilla, it may have been her way of coping, of surviving in a world where she would always be compared to Diana. But for the world, and for Diana's sons, it is a chilling reminder that the past is not just remembered. It is watched, collected, and sometimes even hoarded, in an endless struggle to control what can never truly be controlled.